Welcome to Anomacast. I think I decided on that name. I like it. Other people like it. Last week's show, we talked about the Project Takeover Blues. We're going to move on to something different, which emphasizes our meta-anomalies community. Let me explain very briefly before we get into the topic of our show that meta-anomalies is a meta community. It's a community that tries to help other communities grow and to start and to flourish, both in number and financially. This is a product or a service that Anomalous Design offers to the internet community as a whole. This week, our topic is going to be building communities of the heart. Now, Pete and I collaborated on a couple articles. The first one was actually my baby. It was called The Means to Build a Community. The second one was The War on Error, Part 2, Communities of the Heart, which was Peter's baby. And he and I have decided to put these two things together and have a podcast for a few minutes here to tell you about building communities of the heart. So, Pete, why don't you start off by kind of giving us a summary of those two articles that we can talk about over the next few minutes?
Right. Okay. Thanks, Matt. Hello. Let me preface the subject with a few things first. The main item in the community, whenever communities are founded, is freedom. There is no value of any substance without freedom, without choice, without opportunity. If you take your opportunity choice, there is no accountability, no incentive. Cowed, you are predetermined. There is no spontaneity. These are the values and virtues which should display. That said, freedom has to be governed. Such government, we say, in the communities of the heart we wish to build, should come from within, and that idea of freedom from within and governing oneself in order to be able to relate to one another in decent and not indecent, in a decent and proper way, it is the foundation of what we mean by communities of the heart. I would say the governing of oneself is the idea of restricting the expansiveness of the unbridled ego, as it were. It's not that the ego is bad, it's just that you give it too much space and it takes up the space belonging to others. You nurture it to stand back, allow space to people less fortunate, less able, less farther up the road than you are. It sounds a bit condescending, I expect, but there are degrees of what we could call approaching this, and it is a constant development through your life, and the the self-discipline needed to do this is something that is to be nurtured, and it's not easy, and it's a long job, and it's never perfected. Matt, can you start on something now?
Oh my goodness, Pete, you've given me so much to talk about in just 4 minutes. I love the overview you've given us, and I think it really does resonate very well with what I want to accomplish in meta-anomalies as a whole. Freedom is indeed the place we need to start. Freedom to choose. Freedom to choose. I think you and I have talked about my own visions about what primitive humans were like whenever they were just small wandering bands or maybe even individuals. They had freedom. They had freedom. They had real freedom. They also had adversity, and they also had to experience directly the consequences of whatever choices they made. What the modern world has done to us is it's isolated us from responsibility. It's built layer upon layer by way of technology. And whenever I use technology, I use it in the sense of Jacques Ellul and other early 20th century sociologists that were referring to the efficient use or the quest for efficient means and process. I don't mean machinery necessarily, though machinery is a manifestation of technique. I really misused the word earlier. I should be not using the word technology at all. I really should be just saying technique. Now, this means because we fail to feel the consequences of our decisions, our choices, we lose the chance of spontaneity. And I really like your point that it's in this risk, because all of our technique is formed kind of as a biological, neurological urge to avoid risk. In our quest to avoid risk, to avoid harm, we lose choice, we lose spontaneity, and we lose the ability to cope with our environment. We've created an artificial environment. We're a terrarium.
Yeah, I do think that historically, if you look at this point that you're making, Matthew, for instance, cross-border travel, national border travel. Before the First World War, there were no passports, virtually no passports. It's well known that in the 18th century, one could travel to France from Britain, whilst Britain was at France with war. As an individual citizen, one could travel through France unmolested during the time when the two nations were at war. Now, that sort of freedom, it really is not possible today, and it's just one example of that is symptomatic of the amount of what people used to call red tape or regulation or ticking boxes, filling in forms, bureaucracy, administration. There's a whole cloud of this stuff that surrounds us, and it serves in one way to control us, and in another way, it serves to comfort us, to feel that we're being
Protected.
we're not, protected, looked after. But the myth, as it were, that the government is a parent, as it were, a sort of parent.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, as a parent, you're a child. A child comes of age, doesn't have any legal responsibility, doesn't have any legal culpability to get in it. Accept this role, parent, freedom, you become an adult,
Oh, I think, Pete, I think that our connection got a little bit shaky there at the last. Could you repeat the last sentence?
Yeah, if we accept the role of this, as it were, role of being a child, and the government is not allowing oneself and not accepting, not able to accept the freedom and the risk with it.
Yeah. And in us not being able to accept that freedom, we are inherently losing our ability to self-govern. And that is something that, like, say, the mid-20th century, some people like Elihu again and Varillo, actually Varillo still writes about this even now, pointed out how people didn't even understand what responsibility was. As I like to point out, there's a song from the 1970s by the Canadian rock band Rush, where it's called Free Will. And one of the stanzas in the song is, you can't have something for nothing. You can't have freedom for free. And what we often think of in terms of freedom or self-governance is the absence of responsibility, when in fact, it is the greatest embracing of responsibility. When one says they're free, they should mean that they embrace all the consequences for their choices. They embrace the possibility that what they have decided to do will bring them damage. It will bring them death. And it doesn't just have to bring them success or prosperity. What it does is it brings them responsibility. And we have this misconception, and I don't know where it began, that somehow freedom means Disneyland, Disney World, where everything works out the way that you imagine it to work out. And that's not what it is. Freedom is much more difficult than that. The ability to self-determine is not absolutely mean that you're going to self-determine in the right way. It means that you're going to have to be willing and brave enough to face the consequences of your choices, to prepare, to look at the outcome, and to weigh the risks and choose as wisely as possible. A centralized authority won't allow you to do that. A centralized authority will try to limit your ability to choose because, well, you could talk about the self-perpetuation of a bureaucracy, that a bureaucracy always has to make itself bigger. You could also point out that free-thinking individuals are a threat to a bureaucracy because there would be no need for that bureaucracy, or at least less need.
Yeah. So I think we've covered individual freedom, at least in outline, and that's an essential part of what we want to make our communities from. In relations to one another, though, it might sound from what we said that if you have a host of people like we've described who are free and not trumped up chaos. Yeah, that they can't live together because, as the ancient historian said, Pompey could no longer brook Caesar, and that started the Civil War.
And there will be the potential for conflict whenever you give people freedom.
Yes, there is potential for conflict, but it goes back to the item I was mentioned at the beginning about self-restraint, about understanding oneself, understanding and recognizing when one is out of order, when one is doing something not for the benevolence of one's heart, but for the concupiscence of one's desires.
Yes, ego.
Yeah, and like the simple example of it is the chap who comes and pushes in front of you in a queue. Now, if that chap's, if it's a cue for the doctor and that chap's got a terribly badly bleeding cut, that chap, is entitled to push in front of you.
Yeah, and
but,
the irony. Sorry, go ahead and finish your thought. Go ahead.
I'm just saying, but if that chap's just another chap like you who's got a snivelly cold and wants a few throat lozenges, he should take his turn. And it's this sort of judgment, which is a practical judgment. It's also a judgment of oneself in one's heart, that where your position is in the scale of things, which bond, as it were, the internal sort of understanding and the external expression of it in what place you take in the queue. They bond, and if we as a community understand one another in these ways, that we're willing to forego what we feel is not appropriate in a I was going to say moral, but I don't like the word moral. In a spiritual sense, it's not appropriate in the sense that it would harm us as well as someone else. We would.
Okay, I think I lost Pete. Okay, I'll keep going here, Pete. Hopefully you'll get back into the call. I like what Pete was saying about ego. Oh, you there, Pete? You, Pete?
Yeah, I'm back. Yeah.
Okay. I like what you're saying about ego, and at least for me, what I've thought of it as is in the concept of reciprocity. Mm-hmm. I give you this room because you gave me room. That there is an exchange. There is and I'll use this a lot, there is a brokering between me and you as to what is going to be acceptable and what is not going to be acceptable. Mm-hmm. Your illustration of the emergency or waiting room of a hospital is very good. I have a recent story about this, and I think that this story has been repeated millions of times in modern hospitals. And that is, rather than showing preference to the person who has a serious injury, there are hospitals in the world that make you queue up and wait because it would only be fair if you have to wait your turn. And there's no sense of the context in which something happens. Fairness doesn't mean taking your number and waiting in line while you're bleeding to death. Fairness means that the community at that moment, in that place, in that time, decides what will be fair.
Yeah, the scene of an accident is also a good analogy where you've got triage going on, and judgments are made on the spot in the heat of the moment, which person's to look after. Now, this sounds utilitarian, the idea that you look after the ones in most need. It sounds almost Marxist, the idea that from each according to his gifts and to each according to his needs. But Marx and Jesus had a lot in common, and I think really Marx purloined that one from Jesus, I do think that the key to this, though, is not only in the decisions that arise in this sort of triage of one another's relative necessities or requirements or demands. It's not just that. It's not just the decisions that arise. The gelling together of consensus when people of like mind, and I mean not that they're all clones of one another, but just that they have the same desire to make. You just need a few things: a desire to make a better world, a desire to try to make a better world, because we're not going to make a perfect world. We're going to make something better if we're lucky, and we can only do a little bit. We're not going to be Napoleon. We're not going to be. We're not going to.
The utopian fallacy is well documented, and anyone who studies the history of the last 400 years should recognize that anyone who comes to you with a utopian vision is crazy. They're insane. There is no utopia. Even if you were going to look at the kingdom of God as being a utopian thing, which I hesitate to say that the kingdom of God, even in the first century vision, was utopian. It just doesn't fit. Anyway, Pete, we're running out of time. We're down to the last minute. So, was there anything you want to say to wrap things up?
Yeah, I'd just like to say that the emphasis on freedom, on space, it's space perhaps that we create by being free, but we don't create the space for ourselves. We create it for individuals within the community. And that means that there's degrees and relativity to what degree of space each person occupies, because we're all different. We all have different needs, different aspirations, and we accommodate one another. But we accommodate one another voluntarily, in freedom, and we accommodate one another with a goodwill and in an effort to keep our worser natures, or the things, the schemings that go on in all our minds, keep them at bay, keep them in check. That's what we mean by communities of the heart.
Well, thank you, Pete. That's fantastic. And next week we'll return to our Anomacast blog, and we'll be talking about something in the IT world, probably a project Takeover Blues or something like that. We haven't really decided on what our next topic is, but we'll be sharing this on YouTube, and we hope that people will share this around and we can have some discussion, because the real joy in this isn't just us, standing here and talking for 20 or 30 minutes. The real joy is participating with other people. And I hope everyone has a wonderful day.